Hello. Um, don't normally like this live stuff or even myself on camera for the most part. Um, Basically, I want to talk to everyone who'd listen and kind of go through what's happening in this country in the context of like racial disparities and all that. We constantly have people talking crap about, oh, Republicans this, oh, Democrats that, and understanding that the flight of black people in this country is vastly different than anything in the entire world. Um, Understand if you don't agree with what I'm about to say, that's fine. I don't. It's not here to debate or anything for the most part. I'm just here to legit just present facts and talk about what has happened in this country for generations, for years, for decades, for centuries, and use this as an input for when you see people post dumb crap like, oh, Democrats are the party of slavery, or oh, all lives matter, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's way deeper than that. And if you don't get that, read a book, watch history, listen to the communities around you, and understand that this is far deeper than any other thing you could think about. It's way more than just Black Lives Matter, and understand that even the saying matter, just matter. That's it. Um, so what I'm basically gonna do now is kind of read through this book I've been reading called Black Americans by Alphonso Pinkney. Um, Thankfully, this book I found this book at work. Granted, with the pandemic, I do work. I'm grateful that throughout this pandemic, I have been working. Yeah, and even if you're logging in here to say my hair is crazy, yeah, I don't care about that. There's more important things in the world than hairstyles and fashion and all that good stuff. But I'm kind of gonna be reading through this book and kind of discussing the bits and pieces where I stop. And yeah, just some information. I don't think you can share this video, send this stuff to whoever if they start posting all this weird stuff about like, oh, the other side this, oh, this side's terrible. Understand it's way deeper than that, and we have more in common than the media or even your friends or family think we do. This sense of fear that we have against the other is ridiculous because we're all human, right? The whole all lives matter thing, right? And the context that for so long the all was never true. All men were created equal, leaves out women, leaves out people of color, leaves out so much. So here we go. Historians insist that a knowledge of the past is essential for understanding the present. The axiom is especially relevant insofar as Black Americans are concerned, for there is a unique history. Virtually all aspects of their history are without parallel when compared to those of other minority groups in the United States. The very circumstances which lead to their departure from their homeland, the Middle Passage between Africa and the New World, and the institution of slavery which developed on their arrival in what is now the United States, are unique to only Black Americans out of all U.S. minority groups. Just that right there, I understand. Like, I'm Latino, Latinx, whatever the formation would call it. My parents are Dominican. Apparently, my grandparents were Puerto Rican. And beyond that, I have no context because they're all passed away or colonization. But that right there, no one has the experience as a minority group like Black Americans. Understand that. When you see all these disparity things, like, oh, they're lazy, oh, that, all of it comes from a deeper point of view and history. Because no one in the context of anything in the United States has, or even practically the world in reality, has had the experience in which African Americans have had. The institution of slavery, with all its peculiarities, has left a legacy which continues to play a dominant role in the life of Americans. After nearly 3 decades and a half centuries, after 3.5 centuries, white Americans continue to react to Negroes with a mass irrationality which precludes the complete entrance of blacks into the larger society. For records, this book was written in 1969, and that sentence is still relevant today. What a brand. Yet, it would be difficult to imagine members of a group putting forth more diligent and persistent efforts for acceptance than those put forth by Black Americans. The context of Black Lives Matter is you have this group of people who were so attacked from the second they stepped foot on this planet, on this country, on this soil, and they still love this country. They still are here, and they're still thriving to get better. Again, for those joining now, whatever, the book is Black Americans by Alphonso Pinkney. Again, remember, this book was written in 1969, but I'm just going to read through it because I feel like it's fairly well written and it's still prevalent today. A variety of approaches has been attempted throughout the years, and some gains have been made, but a series of historical circumstances have served to preserve the low status of Negroes in the society. The history of Black people in the United States is a complex one, and no attempt to record this detailed sequence of events in one chapter can succeed. However, certain occurrences have greater bearing on the present status of Black people in American society than others have. It is these circumstances that attention is now turned. Again, with this book, not for nothing, I was kind of insulted when I heard or picked up with the fact that it's going to review the entire history of African Americans or Africans in the United States in about one chapter, which is about 36 pages. And it took me about 3 weeks to finish this one chapter because it was so heavy and raw. Now, granted, I'm also working and things like this. I'm reading this at work, but I would read a paragraph and I would have to put the book down because the realities of the history of what happened and what is happening is crazy. Starting with slavery. Black people were among the earliest participants in the Spanish explorations of what is now the United States. But the first Negroes to settle on its shores arrived in 1619. In that year, a Dutch vessel landed in Jamestown, and the captain sold 20 Negroes to the Virginian settlers. This was 12 years after the establishment in Virginia of the first permanent British colony in America, and 1 year before the Mayflower landed the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. Inasmuch as there was no precedent for slavery in English law, these blacks and those who followed for some time have had the same legal status as white indentured servants. Understand that in the United States, or on this land that we're on, when it was a British colony, we had indentured servitude. You come here because the person paid your ticket out of the country, which had no opportunities for you because you were not a wealthy landowner or had no opportunity to own land because it was all taken. So you had somebody pay your trip to sail across the seas, in which many people died, but that was a better opportunity than what you had in your home country. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Doesn't that sound like the Mexicans and Guatemalans and everyone trying to come to this country for the opportunity to live? I continue. Their term of service was prescribed by local laws. Throughout much of the 17th century, the status of black men was not at all clearly defined. And the institution of chattel slavery gradually evolved in which black people, in part of their physical differences, were to hold a caste position in society. Like white indentured servants, it was possible for them to gain their freedom after working a specified number of years or after conversion to Christianity. So at first, the slaves who were sold by the Dutch, Europeans, who landed on this continent and sold them to other white people, they had the opportunity to be free. Just like all slavery in all of time. We understand, what up, Carl? We understand that it is deeper to understand that the United States and this colony formed slavery in such a way that is so unique and vastly different than everything in the entire world ever. Chinese had slavery. Middle East had slavery. Europeans had slavery. Africans had slavery. Okay, cool. Everyone had slavery. But right there, you see it. At first, you could be freed. You convert to Christianity, you're a free man. You serve a number of years, you're a free man. Boom, done. And that was in 1619, 1620, that first early 1600s. That's what the slavery on this continent was. And let's see what had happened. Their status of, I'm sorry, read that. Oh man, their status was of indentured servants rather than a slave. The ambiguity of their status, combined with the uncertainties attached to the Indian and white indentured servant supply, led to the ultimate relegation of black people to a status of perpetual servitude. So right there you could see the context of, you had the Native Americans, the indigenous tribes who were dying by the millions. Remember, people kind of scoff at that whole 90% of the population died from diseases brought over by Europe. So you couldn't rely on them to be your workforce, as Christopher Columbus, that murderer, was doing, chopping people's hands off because they couldn't find gold. That was happening, and they were also dying in mass. So it was an unreliable workforce. Think about work today. If someone's calling out sick all the time, don't you kind of, oh, this person's always sick, what the hell? Those are commonalities that people share. Now imagine you're trying to force an entire people to work for you, and they keep getting sick and dying. Africans, Europeans, Asians, around similar animals, around similar diseases for thousands of years, they could survive it. So you bring over Europeans in independent servitudes. They are there for the opportunity that you're there for. They're working their 7 years or whatever it was, and boop, they get their 60 acres, little bit of land, and they can start their own life and start for their future and their family. It was not a case for black people because they wanted to switch it up and permanently put them in this caste system. Slavery as practiced in North America was a complex institution. In some respects, the practices varied by state, region, deep south versus border south. The size of the plantation, the number of slaves involved, season of the year, and of course, by the conviction of the individual slaveholders. Oh yeah, in history books, or you could see people who have written, oh, they work alongside their slaves. Ulysses S. Grant, the president of the United States, who started the National Park Service in the context of making Yellowstone National Park. The person who's the last general who helped us win the Civil War for the Union against the Confederates, which were traitors. And keep flying that flag high, right? He owned slaves. And in his autobiography, when you hear about a story, he had a slave. He was against slavery, you know. He combated his father-in-law, who was an avid slave supporter, who was also rich. But he eventually, in his story, still got to read more into it, but apparently he let his slave go. You know, he worked alongside his slave at all times, and it went, right? But he still had it. Was he a good slave owner for letting his slaves go? Was George Washington a good slave owner for letting his slaves go? They were still slave owners. However, many practices were common throughout the slaveholding states. Furthermore, many of the restrictions imposed on slaves were also applicable to free Negroes in the United States, both in the South and elsewhere in the country. In addition to the general characteristics of slavery in the South, of special relevance to the present discussions of the slaves' loss of their native culture, the attitude of white people toward slaves, the reactions of slaves to their status, and the status of black people who technically were not slaves. The first statutory recognition of slavery in North America occurred in Virginia in 1661. This lead was soon followed by the other colonies, and by the time the colonies gained independence, chattel slavery and a body of law defining the status of the slaves had become institutionalized. These laws covered every aspect of the slave's life. In general, slavery in North America developed into her harshest form of social relations ever to exist. Ever to exist. The slave received none of the protections of organized society because he was not considered to be a person. Rather, he was considered to be property, and only to the extent that a citizen's property must be protected could the slave expect society's consideration. So isn't it kind of interesting how we're always talking about protect property? Oh, property is so important. Black people in this country were seen as property, yet we don't want to protect black people. He was endowed by the law with rights over the slave. The slaveholder maintained absolute power over his property. He was endowed by law with rights over the slave. In return, he was expected to assume certain obligations toward the slave. The law required that masters be humane to their slaves, furnish them adequate food and clothing, and provide care for them during sickness and old age. Isn't that socialism, right? Therefore, slaves were at one and the same time human beings and property. Throughout the antebellum South, the cold language of statutes and judicial decisions made it evident that legally the slave was less a person than a thing. Less than a person than a thing. That's right, treated like cattle, not even human. That's how people saw black people in this country. Because remember, I'm reading this about the slaves, but all these perceptions were attributed to the free ones as well. And remember the difference between Deep South and Mid South and North, but it's all the same rationale. In such a status, the slaves were denied virtually all rights, both civil and political. Perhaps the most important element in defining the slave status was the perpetual nature of slavery. Slaves were destined to occupy this status throughout their lives and to transmit it to their children, who in turn transmitted their inherited status to their children. Slavery and Negro became synonymous, and since slaves were defined as innately inferior, Negroes were defined as inferior beings. Slaves in any caste system, in anything in history, were the bottom. And here in the land of the United States, they were perpetuated forever in it. There was no escape. You were a slave, your son was a slave, your grandson was a slave, your daughter was a slave, your granddaughter was a slave, your wife was a slave. All of that was slavery. And you could not ever escape it. Because slaves were forbidden by law to enter in contractual arrangements, their marriages were not legally binding relationships. So the context of, the slave's wife, they separated the families. No, they didn't. Because legally they were nothing. They were nothing to the people who owned them. They were just property. That's right. Heirloom, the generation. Husbands, wives, and children could be separated at the discretion of the slaveholder, as was frequently the case. Thus, it was impossible to maintain a stable family system. So let's think about what happens when people talk about these poor communities today, right? Like, the family's not stable. From the foundation of the entire history of black people in this country, they were not allowed to have stable families. Separated because the slave owner wanted money, or because they gifted a slave to their children who moved away, or to their friends or family. The stability of the family unit was nearly and virtually impossible. The slave family had little importance as regards the traditional functions which marriage was expected to perform for those who entered into the relationship. Parents had little to say or do about rearing children or controlling other forces leading to cohesion in family life. The nature of the institution of slavery was such that no family in the usual sense can be said to have existed. There was no families. They were just properties being sold left and right. The black men were not able to raise their children. The women were forced to raise other children. It gets deeper. Children derived their condition from the status of the mother. The father was not the head of the family, the holder of property, the provider, the protector. His wife could be undressed and either whipped or violated by the slaveholder or overseer in his presence and in the presence of the children. Imagine the trauma of that. Could you imagine today if the person who owned your house could just come in whenever they wanted, have sex with your wife in front of your kids, and you were powerless to do anything about it? Or even the context of someone bursting in and just beating you or your wife in front of everyone, and everyone is powerless to do anything. Dehumanization has been the cornerstone of this slavery in this country, and has been targeted and perpetuated against one certain class of people for centuries. Slaves were property which could be sold, traded, or given as gifts, and slave families were frequently dissolved for economic reasons. So think about right now with the pandemic. You own a bunch of slaves. Oh, I'm going through tough times. Let me just sell this daughter over here. Let me sell the son over here. Let me sell this weak one over there, so you can get by. The disregard of the human beings. As Stamp has written, Stamp is Kenneth Stamp. He wrote The Peculiar Institution back in 1952. But he wrote, "They were awarded as prizes in lotteries and raffles. They were wagered at gambling tables and horse races. They were, in short, property in fact as well as in law." So we see all this, like, what, DraftKings and all this stuff. Instead of putting up money, they put up people. But to them, they weren't people. They were just property. It was just a price number. I bet you a slave that I'm going to flip this coin, is going to be heads. Oh, it's tails. Oh, here's a slave. That's the reality. Female slaves were encouraged to engage in promiscuous relations with other slaves. Although these relations occasionally developed into stable ones, they were more often casual associations entered into the express purpose of reproduction. In the words of Franklin Frazier, who wrote the Negro Family in the United States back in 1966, wrote, "To the slave trader who had only an economic interest in the slave, the Negro was a mere utility. Black lives did not matter." What has changed in 400 years? Clearly, no stable family system could develop under such circumstances. The permanency of marriage depended on those rare opportunities which slaves had to live and work together within a situation of common experience and trust. You had to trust the person who's going through this traumatic experience with you to have your back. You had to build your own community from nothing. And within an instant, the leaders were sold, the people were beaten, they were raped, and given away for funsies. According to the laws of the antebellum South, slaves had no civil or property rights. A slave might not make a will, and he could not, by will, inherit anything. Slaves were not to hire themselves out, locate their own employment, establish their own residence, or make contracts for any purpose. So no bootstraps, right? They could not be a party to suits involving free persons. So if you own a property today and someone damaged it, you can sue them. Cool. The black people then were property and were beaten. They couldn't sue anyone for beating them. You can walk down the street, someone beats you up, can't have them arrested, can't do anything. You just take it. Strict interpretations of laws regulated every aspect of their lives, and the enforcement machinery was such that violation rarely went unpunished. These strict laws were geared towards the behavior of the slaves, but they also clearly regulated the behavior of whites who might interfere with slave discipline. So even if you were like, oh, I'm a good person, I'm a good Christian, this is wrong, you shouldn't be beating people, the laws prevented you to do anything. The social constructs which everyone lived in the United States, before even it was the United States, made you unable to do anything. A variety of punishments was meted out to slaves who were found guilty of violating the slave codes, and the most frequent being whipping for minor crimes, and harsher forms of punishment including burnings and mutilations for much serious crimes. The death penalty was common and resulted from such offenses as striking whites. So if you fought back, they killed you. If you defend yourself, they kill you. Stamp views the rigidity of the codes, the harshness of the punishments as serving to install fear in the slaves. This, he maintains, has accomplished through a series of steps designed by the slaveholders to preserve absolute control over the human property. The steps were accustom him to rigid discipline, demand from him unconditional submission, impress upon him his innate inferiority, train him to adopt the master's code of good behavior, and instill in him a sense of complete dependence. We often are talking crap about how, black people and poor people are dependent on the government. That's the system you created. You created a system in which people were dependent on you to survive, and they were still dehumanized and beaten. The reality is, the system is corrupt. We are all victims of the system, and those who refuse to recognize the system are blinded because they benefit from it. That's right. Break down the person's spirit, they are nothing. And for some reason, after 400 years, we're still here. We still love this country, and we see the opportunities that lie within the words of this foundation of the country, in which was never true to people of color, to women. Don't even get me started on LGBTQ. That's the reality of the United States. The work performed by slaves depended on whether they were on a large plantation or a small farm, whether they were rural or urban, whether the slaveholder specialized in cotton, tobacco, rice, sugar cane, hemp,